War is absolutely a racket. There is no black and white when it comes to warfare. In war, there's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of things that are happening that shouldn't be happening, that maybe don't have to happen. But we have to recognize that there's always going to be differences between peoples. And we know this from group thinking inside of our own country, maybe even in our own city, um, relevant to even sports teams, sports fanatics. There's always room in the human psyche for competition. There's also room for hatred and warfare and competition to the level of, you know, extinction or rebellion. Things like that are very common. And as a reminder for people who are listening and watching the news and seeing what's happening in Israel and Palestine, and who have been watching over what has been happening in Ukraine with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's a rich history behind what has been happening in both fronts, as well as across the world. There's always rich history involved in what ultimately leads to warfare. You see, the news media wants you to understand a very low dimension comprehension of what is going on in either Ukraine or in Israel. The point being is, by the way, Taiwan will be next as well. But this is just geopolitics, and we can discuss it more like in a mature way without getting so attached to the emotional outcome of one side versus another. Are there injustices on both sides? Absolutely. But my point being is that war is a part of the human psyche. It's a part of who we are, and that's just the way it is. It also can be motivated by other powers that I speak about a lot. And you have a lot of various banking interests involved in both conflicts with Ukraine and Israel. There are some national interests that are involved in both Ukraine and Israel, being that the US involvement or European involvement, or what we're looking at in Israel, Africa, Egypt, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, the other Middle Eastern countries. There are kind of agendas at play. So what we're witnessing, essentially, to break it down, is geopolitics at play. We have various different elements and factions inside of various countries that either agree or disagree with the way the world is. A lot of people in these various groups want to reshape the world in their view. It is a very basic fundamental understanding of power. Power seeks to control, to dominate. And so when you have these different groups and these different interests inside of nations, they can become the majority of thought inside of these various countries. It's not very hard to see how those things can transform the way people think. What happens is then the power structure creates consensus within the population. The population then goes on to support what would be deemed of a horrific massacre or a horrible endeavor like warfare. These types of things occur all of the time. You know, we were brought into the Middle East based on 9/11. 9/11, this is very similar to it, but what's happening in Israel. Terrorist attack for the Twin Towers, bringing them down. It was an attack on the country, and many people were enlisted immediately into the military. They felt a call to action, a call to fight in a warfare. Now, what we found out later is that war didn't have the true purpose that people originally thought it did. And many people lost their lives. Many Americans lost limbs. Many Americans are suffering today from psychotic breaks, being in combat, and they're dealing with horrible repercussions. And that's what war does to a country and to a people. And so when you kind of understand how there were various elements of power involved in the war that went on in Afghanistan, the war on terror. It's an endless war and an infinite war. And it was one of America's longest standing wars, was our war in Afghanistan. Over 20 years, multiple generations of fighters went to fight in that region of the world. Our blood and soil is there in that region of the world. And to this moment, as I speak to you, it was almost, and I don't want to say it's entirely, but it was almost pointless. Because the Taliban, who America was sought to destroy, has now controlled the entire country of Afghanistan. They literally run the government there at this minute. And are there some resistance? And maybe there could be some, element of democracy in Afghanistan? Sure, maybe. I don't know. Maybe. Is that what they want, though? You see, because people are all different. They have their reasoning behind desiring certain governments, desiring certain power structures to exist inside of those governments and inside of those countries. So why does America feel like our wonderful freedoms, our wonderful constitution, our republic, which is what it is, not a democracy, our republic is so insistent on creating the same realities in different countries around the world when that's what they don't really want? They could care less, actually. They enjoy the way that they're going in their democracy or level of it, or their government, or how it is run, whether they have a king and a queen still, in some parts of the world, or whether they have some kind of tribal leader that runs the country. That is up to those countries to decide, because every country and all people have independent individual sovereignty. That is what Americans, okay, that's an American value, and that's how America as a whole and the government should look at the rest of the world, is allowing other independent countries to have individual sovereignty in how they run their nations. Now, that is the reason why we in America don't want to be involved in foreign wars. George Washington spoke about this, obviously, as the country was founded. And so going into the minutia of Israel and Palestine and the Palestinians, and then, of course, you have Hamas, which is the kind of extremist group there. You can get into the weeds on this, and we can decide who supports who and what's more justified. Are these attacks on Israel, on what I would consider innocent people, is that justified because of what Israel's done over time to the Palestinians and the Gaza Strip? Or is it not okay at all for that to happen? Is that going to be, even by a PR standpoint, public relations, was that okay for Hamas to do to Israel and to Israelis? Does that help them in the world stage? Because war, as we learned with Ukraine, if you haven't really kept up with it, war is more PR than it is actual fighting. I would say war is like 80% PR. I've known this when I've studied history. The way the newspapers report certain elements of battle, certain fatigue in the armies, the navies of various countries, or the way they report on battles that are won, battles that are lost, those types of news reports, that PR is going to either motivate someone to enlist, motivate a group of people to enlist, obviously, or it's going to help in negotiations for peace. Okay, what kind of PR can we get that's very noticeable that then becomes a part of a negotiation? Those are very, very important elements of warfare. Very important, because how you look upon the world, how you're viewed by the world, is going to either support you to win or is going to rob support from you and your cause. And so is taking innocent civilians as hostage and then killing them on live TV, is that helping your cause in the world supporting you, or is that not? Now, I'm just talking more strategically here. And people can argue whether that's smart, whether that's dumb. That's the question I'm asking. But, when it comes down to it, people are picking black and white as if that this is just the way it is. Here's what I've found interesting. In this particular conflict, there are people, both Israelis, Jews, but Israelis, right? They're both Israelis and Jews, and they're not always both the same. And there are Palestinians and there are Muslims. And of course, there are what would people consider terrorist group, which is Hamas. Okay. These are various groups within a group. However, each of these individuals, by religious sacrosanct, are committed to destroying one another, or at the very least, they're committed to viewing each other as enemies. And not just enemies, but mortal and spiritual enemies. You see, in the war with Ukraine and Russia, they're having a hard time recruiting. On both sides. They're having a hard time getting this war going with deep devotion to the conflict from each individual person inside of the military on every level. However, in a conflict with like Israel and Palestine and what is Hamas, which is, again, Palestinians in many cases, that is a little bit of a hairy, prickly situation. Because each individual inside of these subgroups, inside of the military even, in these groups, view their cause as spiritual warfare. They see and view the other side as spiritually immoral. And they view the other side as spiritually condemned. Okay? This is the kind of level we're speaking to here. Very different than the war with Russia and Ukraine. And I'm just making that as an example because that's currently also happening. They're not fighting to the bitter end there in Ukraine. They're very much like, I'm not saying like warfare is horrible, but they're not playing it easy. It's just when you surrender, like that's okay to surrender. There's certain codes of conduct that are followed in that type of warfare scenario. However, when you have these bitter enemies who truly, to the core of each individual, believes that they are spiritually inclined to destroy the other, when you have that level of hatred and intensity, you're not going to get the same code of conduct that we see inside of places like Russia and Ukraine. Again, you can't black and white it. Oh, Russia. Oh, Ukrainians. Oh, Nazis. Okay, yes. However, when it comes down to the actual fighting, there's some level of conduct that is respected between both groups. Okay, I'm just not all the time, not saying it's perfect, but I'm saying that tends to happen. So with what's going on there, I just want to mention very clearly, there is no black and white. And guess what? This is a new war. This is an actual war that is being declared by Israel. I mean, this is an official war. And a lot of this happened, there's a lot of various reasons, but we have a lot of weakness here in America. We sent $6 billion back to Iran. Iran funds Hezbollah and Hamas. Everyone knows that. American dollars and American weapons have gone to fund this conflict. I mean, already, just think about that. American dollars and weapons have been used already to kill people in this warfare. That's how involved the military-industrial complex is within America, in other nations, and in foreign wars, foreign transactions, foreign conflicts. So I just want to mention that. At the end of the day, Americans on average, they don't want to see war. They want to see peace, and they want to see happiness, and they want to see, butterflies and rainbows. However, we have to be reminded that that is not how the world works. There's a very, very tiny percent of the population in some parts of Europe and America that live at peace most of the time. Now, I'd say a lot of crime is happening lately in America, and there's a lot more race division and various problems here. But mostly, I would say we're privileged enough in America to live at peace and not understand the intensity of warfare and hatred that still occurs all across the world, okay? All over the world. There's pure hatred. We're talking like, I'm not saying all, but like Japanese and Chinese, like they do not like each other. Okay, like that is the discrimination against them, each other, is real. Okay, and here in America, we still complain that we're this melting pot, yet we have very, very, very little, almost respectable amount of discrimination compared to the rest of the world. Okay, so that's another, high horse that people tend to be on. Like, oh well, we're not there, we're not good enough. And it's like, man, go look at the rest of the world. Okay. Chinese are the most homogeneous population in the world, as well as Israelis, by the way. Israelis, you're not allowed to marry, interracial, things like that are still in existence today in Israel. So to sit here and say like, oh my gosh, America is just so discriminatory. We're the worst people ever. Are you kidding me? Have you ever been anywhere else in the world? They hate each other. Literally, there are people in Africa, there would be in Libya or in Morocco, or even, let's just pull away from the Middle East for a second, in Nigeria. There's people who hate each other, and they're from a different tribe, and we're talking like they're neighbors. They live within 5 miles of each other. So there's a lot of element of hatred and discrimination that happens all over the world that I have to say America is not prevalent to as much. Doesn't mean it's non-existent, but it just means that, like, wow, we've come a long way. Let's take our pride in that. My point being is lots of Americans seem to have a lot of, strong opinions one way or another inside of a war halfway across the world once again. And so we have to be very mindful and cautious of our energy, cautious of how we go about transitioning our energy into these various conflicts. This is a part of divide and conquer. This is a part of the power structure's way to create a new war, create new fomenting on both sides, to destabilize various aspects of the world. The military-industrial complex, they see what's happening in Ukraine. Mind you, the Ukraine funding has been just money laundering, okay? And Congress just removed the Speaker of the House. This was a Republican, okay? This Kevin McCarthy, Speaker of the House, was just removed last week. Realizing that removal of the Speaker of the House deals directly with funding of a war in Ukraine. Notice as soon as this person is dethroned, and there's a serious conversation around the funding of Ukraine's war with Russia, we have this war break out in Israel. Again, it's not correlating everything together perfectly or like a symphony here, but just be a witness to what's really going on. The military-industrial complex, large military companies like Raytheon, BlackRock even, who funds a lot of these military weapons depots and manufacturing companies. There's Lockheed Martin. There's Boeing. These huge, large companies that develop weapons are making a killing when war is happening. We pull out of Afghanistan. Within a month or two, we have war in Ukraine. Now we say, hey, Ukraine war looks like it's fizzing out. Military-industrial complex isn't interested in continuing to push the war because the money's drying up. Money from Congress, money from America, by the way, really suspicious already, to say the least. And so what you're witnessing is as money dries up in one part of the world, one region of war, another war breaks out in another region, very close by, somewhat correlated, but not really. But you have that war breaking out. Now what's happening? Calls for congressional funding, U.S. involvement in this war. This is an ally in war. Now, to be fair, there's a lot more ties to Israel that America has that we in America do not have with Ukraine. Ukraine was not a part of NATO. NATO is an alliance that if one country is attacked, they are all attacked. Ukraine was not a part of NATO. And so we in America and in Europe, we couldn't by peace agreement, by alliance, we couldn't declare war on Russia based on an attack on Ukraine. This was the whole premise of that war. And so the ante is being brought up even higher with Israel. Israel is very, very tied into America in many different ways. And there is a spiritual calling for a lot of conservatives to fund a war and even to back a war in Israel using American boots on the ground. I'm telling you, within hours, we're going to hear conservative people in politics right now talk about boots on the ground in Israel. So again, I just want to clarify that for everyone to understand and get in and realize that this war is not everything that you think it is. So I want to just wrap that up and do a podcast. I'm going to do a part 2 to this because we're going to talk about how war is a racket and how there's a beautiful, awesome book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman that is actually published, and a very fascinating read about how somebody who starts wars basically using banking, financing, and using deals under the table with bribes to politicians and various things. We'll get into that in the part 2 of this, but I wanted to come on here and address this intense news that's going on. And of course, my heart goes out to every single innocent person involved in warfare. And war is a destructive, horrific thing. It brings out the absolute worst in humanity. And so I just wanted to chime in on this. Part 2 will come at you very, very soon. Appreciate you guys tuning in.